In 1532, the Ottoman Empire launched a new campaign. This time, it was meant to push deep into Central Europe and to erase Vienna. After earlier failures, the empire advanced with a massive army and heavy weapons, artillery, cavalry, siege engineers. Everything pointed toward a single belief. This time Vienna would fall and Ottoman prestige would be restored. But for the campaign to succeed, nothing could be left behind. Every road had to be secured. Every fortified position along the route had to be eliminated. One of them was Kőszeg, a small frontier town, fewer than 1,000 defenders, a place expected to surrender like so many others before it. No one expected what happened next. Instead of collapsing, Kőszeg resisted. Days turned into weeks. Ottoman guns battered the walls day and night. Assault followed assault. What should have been a brief stop became a prolonged siege. And in the end, a town that should have fallen quietly became the place where the Ottoman advance stopped and where a campaign meant to reshape Europe was forced to come to an end. In Central Europe, peace in the early 1530s was more illusion than reality. The fighting had stopped, but nothing had been settled. When the Ottoman army withdrew from Vienna in 1529, Europe exhaled, but only briefly. The city had survived, yet no treaty followed, no borders were agreed upon, no balance was restored. Instead, the region was left suspended between fear and inevitability. From the Ottoman perspective, the retreat from Vienna was not a defeat in the usual sense. Whether distance and logistics had intervened, not the collapse of Ottoman power. The army had proven it could reach Vienna. What remained unresolved was whether it could finish what it had started. In the years that followed, Hungary remained fractured. Rival kings claimed authority. Fortresses changed hands. Loyalty depended on proximity, pressure, and survival. For the Ottomans, this instability was not an obstacle, it was an invitation. A divided frontier meant no unified resistance, and no unified resistance meant opportunity. For Suleiman, the Magnificent, this uncertainty could not be allowed to harden into permanence. An empire built on momentum cannot afford unresolved fronts. Leaving Vienna unconfronted year after year risked turning a temporary setback into a symbol of limitation. Equally important was timing. Across Europe, defenses were slowly adapting. Fortifications were improving. Alliances were forming, even if imperfectly. Every year of delay worked against Ottoman leverage. What had to be done before. Resistance fully organized. By 1532, the decision was no longer theoretical. The new advance was not framed as a reckless gamble, or as a simple repeat of 1529. It was conceived as a controlled campaign aimed at reasserting dominance along the Hungarian frontier, clearing resistance and reopening the road west under better conditions. If Vienna could be pressured again, quickly Europe might fracture under the strain. Preparation began months before the army moved. Orders went out across the empire. Troops assembled from distant provinces. Engineers prepared siege equipment. Supply lines were mapped, guarded, and reinforced. This was not the sound of an empire rushing. It was the sound of one correcting a pause. On the opposite side, the borderlands understood what was coming along. Before banners appeared, small fortresses did not expect rescue. They expected impact. Their role was not to win, but to slow, to force the Ottoman army to spend time, effort, gain attention where it could least afford to. Among these places stood Kőszeg, known to Western chroniclers as GNS. It was not large, it was not heavily armed, and it was never meant to face the full weight of an imperial campaign. As summer approached, the Ottoman columns finally began to move. The vanguard advanced first. Scouts, cavalry, engineers, testing roads, securing crossings and clearing the path. Behind them followed the mass. Ahead of them lay the frontier. And at the edge of that frontier, small towns waited, not yet under attack, but already running out of time. The Ottoman advance of 1532 was not a raid. It was the full movement of an empire. The goal of the campaign was clear from the start. This was not about pressure or negotiation. The road led west, and at the end of that road stood Vienna. The intention was simple and final: reach it, break it, and remove it as a threat forever. When the Ottoman army entered western Hungary, its scale was overwhelming. Temporary sources differ, but most describe a force numbering in the tens of thousands, possibly more than 100,000, when logistics and support units are included. Infantry, cavalry, artillery, engineers, and supply columns stretched behind the vanguard like a moving state. An army of that size could not tolerate danger on its flank. The march toward Vienna depended on secure roads, steady supply lines, and constant communication. Leaving a fortified town behind, especially near the frontier, meant exposure to raids, broken logistics, and pressure from the rear. Even a small garrison, if ignored, could slow the entire campaign later under far worse conditions. For a campaign built on speed and momentum, that risk was unacceptable. The route had to be cleared. And along that route stood Kőszeg. When the Ottoman vanguard reached the area in early August, its mission was straightforward. Scouts moved. Ahead, cavalry secured the surrounding ground. Engineers began their surveys. From the outside, the fortress did not look impressive. A small town, modest walls, no visible heavy artillery. Against an imperial army of this size, it appeared to be a problem that could be solved quickly. Inside Kőszeg, the numbers told a different story. The entire defending force consisted of only 700 to 800 men, including soldiers and armed civilians. Command belonged to Nicolae Urizio, a professional officer hardened by frontier warfare and fully aware of his situation. There were no reserves, no relief army waiting nearby. Whatever happened here would be decided by the people already inside the walls. Urizio understood the imbalance immediately. He also understood the stakes. Every day Kőszeg held meant one more day for Vienna to prepare. If Kőszeg surrendered, the road into Central Europe would lie open. The decision, therefore, was unavoidable. Kőszeg would fight. Urizio did not prepare for a decisive battle. He prepared for endurance. The gates were sealed early. Guards were placed deliberately where Ottoman scouts could see them. The intent was not provocation, but clarity. This fortress would not open its doors simply because a great army had arrived. Inside the walls, preparations were calm and practical. Weapons were checked and redistributed. Mortar and shot were counted and carefully rationed. Weak sections of the walls were reinforced with timber, earth, and whatever materials were available. Civilians were organized into working groups. Some carried supplies, others repaired damage. Others cleared internal paths for movement. Anyone still able to work was given a task. Panic was not something they could afford. Outside the walls, the Ottoman presence grew thicker by the day. Camps expanded. Engineers marked future artillery positions. Messengers rode back toward the approaching main army, carrying the same conclusion. The fortress was small, but the gates were closed, and it was alert. By the end of this phase, both sides understood the situation clearly. Kőszeg would not be bypassed, and it would not surrender at the first demand. The Ottoman vanguard had finished its assessment. The next step would be pressure. The shift from observation to action was not dramatic. It was deliberate. Once the decision was made to take Kőszeg by force, the Ottoman army moved into a familiar rhythm. Engineers stepped forward first. Trenches began to cut into the ground inch by inch, angled to reduce exposure from the walls. Earthworks rose. Timber was dragged into place. The siege was being built, not rushed. Then the artillery arrived. Ottoman guns were positioned methodically, not for spectacle, but for pressure. The first shots were measured. They tested the walls, searched for weak points, and sent a clear message into the fortress. This would not be a brief encounter. Inside the walls, the defenders felt the change immediately. Stones shook. Dust fell from the ceilings. The sound alone was exhausting. Nicolae Urizio understood that the early phase of a siege was often the most dangerous, not because of destruction, but because of fear. If morale collapsed early, the walls would not matter, so he kept his men focused. Turn fire was controlled and limited. Ammunition was too precious to waste on noise. When Ottoman troops moved close to the walls, defenders responded sharply. Musket shots, crossbow bolts, and stones dropped from above, not to win ground, but to deny it. The Ottomans launched their first direct probes soon after. Small assault. Groups advanced with ladders, testing reactions, searching for hesitation. They were met with resistance at every attempt. Ladders were pushed away, men fell. The attacks were not meant to break the fortress yet, but they revealed something unexpected. The garrison was still organized, still disciplined, still fighting. Days passed. The bombardment continued. Sections of wall cracked, but did not collapse. Fires broke out and were beaten down by civilians working alongside soldiers. Wounded men were pulled back, replaced by others who had already been awake too long. For the defenders, every day survived felt borrowed. For the besiegers, every day spent here felt wasted. The imbalance in numbers was never in doubt. The Ottoman army could rotate units, absorb losses, and continue. Kőszeg could not. Every casualty reduced an already thin line. Every hour eroded strength, but the fortress did not fall. By mid-August, frustration was creeping into the Ottoman camp. What had been expected to take days was stretching into weeks. Supplies were being consumed, weather windows were narrowing, and the main objective, Vienna, remained ahead, untouched. Kőszeg had become more than a target. It had become a problem. Each failed assault forced new calculations. More guns, more pressure, more time, and time was the one resource the campaign could least afford to lose. Inside the fortress, the situation was desperate but clear. No relief had arrived. No walls had miraculously strengthened. There would be no turning point except endurance. As the fighting ground on one truth settled over both sides, this was no longer about a small town. It was about whether momentum could be stopped by men who had nothing left to offer except refusal. By late August, the siege had reached a point the Ottoman command had not planned for. Kőszeg was still standing. The walls were damaged. Sections were cracked. The defenders were exhausted and short on supplies. But the fortress had not collapsed, and that fact alone was beginning to reshape the campaign. For an army of imperial size, time was never neutral. Every additional day consumed food, fodder, and strength. Every delay narrowed the window before weather and distance turned from obstacles into enemies. The Ottoman camp began to feel that pressure. Artillery fire intensified. Guns were repositioned to concentrate on weakened sections. Of the walls, assault groups were pushed forward with greater urgency, not because success was guaranteed, but because patience was running out. Inside the fortress, the situation was grim. Nikolai Urizio knew the limits were approaching. Ammunition was low. Many of the defenders were wounded, some fighting through pain that no longer faded with rest. Civilians were constantly repairing damage under fire, carrying water and supplies through smoke and debris. There was no illusion left. If the walls failed completely, the defense would end quickly. And yet, the fortress still denied the Ottomans a clean victory. This was the moment when the siege stopped being a local problem and became a strategic one. The main objective of the campaign, Vienna, remained untouched. Each day spent at Kőszeg was a day not spent advancing west. Reports moved through the chain of command. Calculations changed. The campaign that had begun with confidence now faced an uncomfortable reality. Even if Kőszeg fell tomorrow, the damage was already done. The calendar had shifted, momentum had slowed. Options were narrowing. For Suleiman the Magnificent, the decision was no longer about pride or punishment. It was about risk. Forward, late in the season, against a more alert and prepared Vienna, carried consequences far greater than the loss of time already endured. The siege continued, but its meaning had changed. Kőszeg was no longer just resisting, it was forcing a choice. And in war, forcing a powerful enemy to choose, especially under pressure, can matter more than any single breach in the wall. In the final days of August, the Ottoman command was forced to confront a reality it could no longer ignore. Kőszeg had consumed far more time than expected. Supplies were being burned at an unsustainable rate. The season was changing, and every mile west now carried increasing risk. The fortress was still resisting. But more importantly, the campaign itself was slipping out of alignment. Pushing forward meant approaching Vienna late in the season, facing stronger defenses with stretched logistics and no margin for error. A decisive victory was no longer assured. What remained was the danger of becoming trapped in a prolonged struggle or worse. So the pressure began to ease. Artillery fire slowed. Assaults became less frequent. Units started to reposition, not forward, but sideways and back. Camps were reorganized. Equipment was prepared for movement, not attack. At this point, the Ottoman command reached a strategic decision. The siege would be ended. The army would withdraw from Kőszeg. The order was not announced publicly. There were no signals of victory or defeat. The withdrawal unfolded step by step, carefully controlled. Artillery was pulled back first. Closest camps were dismantled. Forward units began leaving positions. They had held for weeks. By then, the fighting was effectively over. Even if the defenders inside the fortress could not yet be certain of it, Nicola Urizio did not celebrate. He did not open the gates. He waited. Only when it became unmistakably clear that Ottoman forces were withdrawing from the entire area did the truth finally settle in. The siege was over. It's not through victory, not through surrender, but through withdrawal. The defenders had survived. They emerged into a town marked by weeks of fire and exhaustion. Walls were damaged. Homes lay in ruins. The wounded were everywhere. There was no illusion of triumph in the usual sense. What remained was survival and an understanding of its cost. Outside Kőszeg, the Ottoman army moved on, redirecting its strength elsewhere. The road toward Vienna was closed for that year. The great confrontation Europe had feared did not take place, not because the empire lacked power, but because time had run out. For Kőszeg, the outcome was never about defeating an army of tens of thousands. It was about forcing that army to stop, to think, and to choose. And in the end, that choice reshaped the entire campaign. Kőszeg did not end the war. It did something quieter and more lasting. The Ottoman Habsburg struggle continued for decades. Armies would march again. Cities would fall. Borders would shift back and forth. But after 1532, one truth was firmly established. Even the strongest campaigns could be disrupted by places that refused to disappear on schedule. Kőszeg became a reference point not because of destruction, but because of restraint. It showed how time itself could become a weapon. Not through brilliance or overwhelming force, but through discipline, patience, and the refusal to yield too early. For Nicola Urizio and the people who stood with him, there were no parades waiting. What remained was memory passed down, marked, and preserved. In Kőszeg, the daily ringing of the bell would later come to symbolize not victory, but survival. And that is why the siege still matters. Not because an empire was defeated, but because an empire was delayed. History often celebrates the moment. Walls fall. Kőszeg reminds us that sometimes history turns on the moment they do not. And in 1532, that moment was enough.